Hi all, welcome to Chapter 8, the last and final chapter that we'll be covering in this class. So Chapter 8 will cover language and thought. Now, I've taught this before at a different university using a different textbook, and I like that the flow of that textbook better and kind of the information covered in that textbook better. So for this chapter, I want you guys to focus just on the slides, not on the textbook, okay? Because what we're going to cover is going to be in a different order. We're also going to go into a bit more detail in some parts that your textbook doesn't cover. And then we're going to kind of skip over some stuff that your textbook does cover, okay? So I want you guys to focus more on just these slides rather than the textbook. So let's get started. First, we're going to talk about what is language. So language consists of a system of symbols and rules, and by combining these symbols and rules, we can generate an infinite number of possible messages and meanings, okay? Now, we also have this thing called psycholinguistics, and this is just this scientific study of the psychological aspects of language. So that's kind of what we're doing in this chapter, is we're kind of learning how to be a psycholinguistic. Okay? So first, when we talk about understanding language, then we need to understand what are the different properties of language. So the properties of language can be split up by talking about its symbols and its structure. So the use of sounds, signs, and gestures help create a language. So not all languages are verbal. So we've got like ASL, sign language. That's still a language, even though we don't produce sound. There's also written languages, so some of those ancient languages that aren't around anymore, we still see written signs of it. And even though we can't hear it, then it's still a language. And what language does is it allows for forming and transferring mental representations. So it's how we communicate with each other. Now, language, we have these symbols and signs and gestures, but we also have structure. So when we're talking about the structure, we're usually talking about grammar. So grammar is the set of rules that dictate how the symbols can be combined to create meaningful units of communication. So rather than just jamming a bunch of letters and sounds together, we're creating something that actually means something. So again, language conveys meaning. Just producing sounds that doesn't have meaning, that is not language. But by producing sounds or a combination of symbols or gestures that convey meaning, that is language. So when talking about the meaning, we often talk about the semantics. So the semantics is the meaning of the words and sentences. So we can form and transfer our mental representations that have meaning. So this is how we share information, right? So this could be information of how are you feeling today. So that's the mental representation of your emotion. It could also be sharing information such as where is there food? Is there a predator nearby? And that's how a lot of languages kind of start out. So another property of language we talk about is generative. So that means it permits displacement. So generativity combines the symbols to generate an infinite number of messages that can have novel meaning. Okay, so that's how we know something's a language. By being able to rearrange things to create an infinite number of meanings. Displacement is another important term, and this can communicate about events and objects not physically present. In other words, language allows us to talk about things that aren't here. So for instance, if I ask you about what you had for dinner yesterday, that's an example of displacement because you can tell me about something that's not physically present. It's about something that happened previously. So that's an example of a past, future, imaginary events, symbolic representation. So again, you can think of it as, what are your hopes and dreams? What's something that happened in the past? Tell me about, a dream you had. Something like that. Those are all examples of displacement. The surface structure and deep structure of language are also two things that psycholinguistics look at. So surface structure, when we talk about that, we're talking about ways that the symbols are combined. So specifically the syntax, so the rules for how we can combine things. So that's the surface structure, is the rules of combining those physical symbols. So whether those symbols are letters or gestures, or even the sounds, it's that syntax, the rules, the grammar. Now the opposite of that is deep structure. So deep structure is the underlying meaning of the combined symbols. So again, we're focusing more on the semantics here, the meaning, which are the rules for connecting the symbols. So syntax is how we combine things like grammar, but semantics is connecting the symbols. Language also has a hierarchical structure. So that means that there's multiple different sections, like bits of information that are combined to create language. So in this hierarchical structure, the smallest unit is called a phenome. So these phonemes are the smallest units of sound recognized as separate, okay? So they don't correspond to the letters of the alphabet, they're sounds. So instead of the vowels are A, E, I, O, U, then it'd be the sound. So A, E, O, U, like those kinds of things, right? Those are phonemes. Those are the smallest units of sound. So humans, we can produce hundreds of phonemes. And not all languages use the same phonemes. And that's actually what tends to separate different languages, is what phonemes they use as well as how they combine them. So if we start to get a little bit bigger on this hierarchical structure, then after phonemes, then we've got morphemes. Okay, so morphemes are the smallest unit of meaning. So this is where you combine phonemes to create a unit of meaning. Syntax is a little bit bigger or higher on the structure, and it determines how the phonemes combine into those morphemes. Okay, so some are single letters like S or D, and some are single syllable words like hat, bat. That's a single morpheme. Okay, so morphemes can be a letter. It can also be a single syllable word. Moving up from that, we've got words. So words, some morphemes are a single word, but most words are made up of multiple morphemes. And then you've got a phrase. A phrase tends to be a conceptual unit that's made up of words, multiple words. And then a sentence, again, is made up of lots of words, and it can also include multiple phrases. And so a sentence is the highest part in our hierarchy. Now here's just an example of how that hierarchy looks. So on the bottom here, we've got our phonemes, right? So those are those individual sounds. Then we've got morphemes. So the morphemes are the smallest unit of meaning. And you can notice that some of these only contain one phenome, but also some of them will contain multiple phonemes. Okay? And then from phonemes, we go to words. So the words, again, they are a combination of multiple morphemes to create a word. Now again, some words are just one morpheme, but most contain multiple. And then we've got phrases. Okay, so the players, that actually means something. So it's a meaningful combination of words. And then talk to the fans, that's another phrase that also makes sense by itself. And then when you combine phrases, you create a sentence. Okay? And then after you have a sentence, then that's what we call discourse. So you say a sentence and then something's going to follow it, whether it's you continue with a new sentence or someone responds to it. So that is the structure of language and the properties of language.